Thanks, Bob, and hello, everyone. As Bob said, I'm Katie Goen, Senior Content Producer at Alert Media, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator today. So we are here to discuss fire preparedness in the workplace, right? Why it's important to have a comprehensive strategy, why it's important that that strategy is inclusive of all employees, and why it's important to level it up now. So with that in mind, I am going to introduce today's speakers. So first we have Stan Spitek, who is lovingly referred to in the industry as Stan the Fireman. And he is a former deputy fire chief and fire marshal in the Chicago area fire department. And he served that community for 26 years before he honorably retired in 2003. Now, Stan is the president of Fire and Life Safety Inc., which is a consulting firm that provides life safety, risk management, and emergency preparedness programs for organizations of all sizes and industries. He is also the life safety and disaster planning consultant for the Arizona Healthcare Association, the California Association of Health Facilities, the Utah Healthcare Association, and many, many more state healthcare associations around the country. So we are in good hands today. Hi, Stan. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for that introduction, Katie.
Of course. And I would also like to introduce Peter Steinfeld. Peter has been involved in the emergency communications industry for more than 20 years now. He is the Senior Vice President of Safety Solutions at Alert Media. So he works with a wide range of organizations to help support their employee safety, business continuity, and emergency preparedness initiatives. And he's also the host of the Employee Safety Podcast at Alert Media. And some of his recent episodes include interviews with Amazon, Salesforce, the CDC. I could go on and on. And a fun fact is actually Stan the Fireman was on the podcast last year discussing wildfire preparedness. So if you're interested in that aspect of fire preparedness, you're definitely going to want to check that out. But back to you, Peter. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
No, it's great to be here. Stan is definitely the star of the show today. So thank you for being here, Stan. I'm really super excited about it.
Ditto. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time. And I just want to quickly, before we get started, go over the agenda for the day, just so everybody knows what to expect in the next, hour or so. So we're going to talk about what a comprehensive fire preparedness plan entails and why you need one. We're going to talk about how to understand regulatory requirements that may apply to your organization specifically. We're going to talk about how to assess risk and develop your fire preparedness plan. And then finally, we're going to go over some tips for communicating that plan effectively to the appropriate stakeholders. So before we get into the presentation, I do want to launch our first poll for the day. And I encourage you to participate in the polls because this is really going to help us guide the conversation towards the information that's going to help you the most. So with that in mind, if you'll answer the question on your screen now, and that's what aspects of fire preparedness would you like to learn more about today? And you can choose as many as you want here. It doesn't have to be just one, but maybe you're interested in the differences between a basic plan and a comprehensive plan. Maybe you want to determine the risks and the probability in the workplace. Maybe specific advice on how to build a comprehensive fire plan. Perhaps how to make your plan inclusive of all employees. Or maybe it's just those best practices for communication, which are always important. So I'm going to go ahead and give that just a few more seconds if you guys will get your answers in now.
I think the word fire is missing off number 2, the workplace fire.
I think we do have a little bit of an issue here on these answers, but I think people get the gist of it. So Bob, let's go ahead and close this one out and we'll share the results. All right. So great, right? Everything is represented here. So obviously all of these things are important to some of you in some way, shape, or form, but it's looking like that how to determine the risks and probability of a workplace fire and how to build that plan are our front runners here. And then of course the communication is kind of just behind that. So let me go to you, Stan. Is this about what you were expecting from all the clients you work with on this kind of stuff?
Well, absolutely. The inquiry or the poll that we put out really focuses on the threat of fire. And it's good to know that people understand they need to know what they don't know. So much relative to emergency planning, disaster planning is focused on that concept of hazard vulnerability assessment or risk analysis. You don't know what you don't know until you go through some type of process to identify the threats and perils. And certainly one that's common to all types of workplaces is fire. And then, it's no surprise that developing that comprehensive plan is of interest to everybody. Peter, are you thinking the same thing? Are we on the same page with how we're analyzing these results here?
Yeah, and I'm actually super excited to see that option 3 was one of the most popular, that people are going beyond just the basics and they
Yep,
want to do comprehensive. That makes me very happy.
sure does.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys both for that. And I think we can go ahead and now move into some important fire statistics, the differences between basic and comprehensive fire preparedness, and then, of course, why it's important to improve your fire safety plan now. So, Peter, can you go ahead and kick that off for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think let's begin by just taking a look at some rather alarming numbers from the National Fire Protection Agency that you're seeing here on the screen. So a structure fire occurs every 64 seconds in the United States. So basically, on average, a fire breaks out every minute of every day, which is just incredible to wrap your head around. But this chart shows fire statistics broken down by structure type. And as you can see here, it includes nearly every industry and business type. And these numbers are just a great example of why organizations should never have a mindset of it won't happen to us or it just won't happen here. The risk may be low, but it certainly can happen, and it happens fast. So granted, these numbers that you're seeing here are pre-COVID, but with many industries and different organizations returning to the workplace, I think it's pretty safe to assume that these fire statistics could be comparable or perhaps even increase as more employees start to return to the workplace. The question is why? Well, interestingly, the top cause of non-residential fires are actually the same as residential fires. Number 1 is cooking. Hard to believe, but it's true. And number 2 is just carelessness, more believable. With more people physically in the workplace, those fire risks increase. Now, there are a number of reasons why you should not wait to improve your fire preparedness strategy, and that's on this next slide you're seeing here. For starters, unfortunately, the pandemic has negatively impacted fire safety in the workplace. Just think about the increased fire hazards that organizations are now facing due to COVID protocols. Things that are pretty simple, but people often overlook, like having alcohol-based hand sanitizer stations or bottles literally all over the place every few feet. That's a fire concern. Some companies have an influx of PPE. They have nowhere to store it, so they stack it in places that are probably not the best places to stack it, like obstruction of egress points, like stairwells and hallways and doors that people should try to get through. It's just natural human behavior. People do that. Secondly, there's millions of employees returning to the office or job sites. It's really starting to come back, who just may need a refresher in fire safety. It was kind of ignored over the last few years as people weren't coming to the office. Plus, having more people on site means increased potential for human-related fire threats. Based on a recent study, it was about, I think 89% of employees think that a safe workplace is more important than ever. So if they're returning to a physical location, they want to know that you have their back so they can feel safe and be productive. Goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If people don't feel safe, they can't focus on being productive. So it's super important to give them that psychological safety. And due to the Great Resignation and other hiring challenges, there's actually an increase in turnover as well as new hires. And all those employees need to be trained in fire preparedness as soon as possible, preferably in the onboarding process, but then also regularly moving forward. You always have to remember that. Also, organizations must now extend duty of care to employees that are working remotely. It's a concept people didn't really a lot of organizations didn't have before COVID. Also to traveling workers or just any dispersed workers that are not in a main area that people come together typically. So they got to consider how to train and educate all those people on fire safety and preparedness wherever they might work. And then just for those of you who are unfamiliar, duty of care as a term, it's really an organization's moral and increasingly legal responsibility and obligation really to keep their employees safe and well while performing their jobs. And then finally, to wrap up this slide, leveling up your fire preparedness plan can really just improve stakeholder trust and appreciation. whether that's your employees themselves, vendors, visitors, customers, could be partners. Stakeholders will have more peace of mind knowing that their safety is indeed your top priority, which is crucial. Now, hopefully, most organizations have at least a bare minimum fire preparedness plan in place, and it sounds like the way you guys answered the poll, you want to get above that. But just to point out here, some struggle to even meet the minimum requirements, or they just failed to train on the basics, such as fire extinguisher use and evacuation procedures. Most of you on this call or on this Zoom, on this web meeting, are probably familiar with the OSHA standard 1910.39. It addresses fire prevention plans. But if not, here are just some of the minimum elements. For an organization that has 10 or more employees, there must be an established oral and written plan that includes, I'm not going to read them all, but just you see them here, things like a list of all major fire hazards, proper handling and storage of hazardous materials, and everything you're seeing on the screen. I think the National Park Service sums it up pretty well. You see it here. They say fire prevention is key, but fire preparedness is just as important. You got to stop and just think about that for a second. Seems the same, but it's not quite. Now, with that said, both Stan and I encourage you to go beyond compliance, and it sounds like that's why you're here on this call, and Stan's the best person in the world, I think, to offer this advice, to go and create a comprehensive, sustainable fire preparedness program. Now, what does a comprehensive fire preparedness plan look like? Well, as we move on to this next slide you're seeing here, it all depends on your organization. But there is a simple framework that helps to outline it. First, conduct a risk, or call it a hazard, vulnerability assessment, and then develop your plan based on those findings. Next, you want to create very clear policies and procedures based on what you discovered in step one. And then third, implement a communication plan that reaches all your stakeholders. Don't forget anyone, and there's a lot. I mentioned that list earlier. And then lastly, facilitate training and testing in a fashion that is really commensurate with your audience and their risk profile. And it can be pretty different based on those different stakeholders. Stan's going to go into a lot more detail on each of these steps later in the presentation, but you can see how a comprehensive plan really differs from OSHA's basic guidelines that we showed before. It can help position a company for success. I would like to share another sobering statistic. 62% of employees would hesitate, basically guess, or simply not react to a crisis in the workplace. That's kind of scary, that people like, hey, it's deer in the headlights. I'm just not going to do anything when a crisis occurs. And the question is why? What's going wrong? What's causing them to do that? It's because they don't know what to do. They simply haven't been told, they haven't been trained, or they haven't been made aware of how to react and to respond to a workplace fire or any other kind of emergency. And that's where these comprehensive plans come into play. All right. Well, Katie, I think we have another poll lined up, right? So maybe we can get some good feedback from audience like we did before to continue to use that feedback and how audience might categorize their fire safety.
Absolutely. This is a great time for that. So let's go ahead and launch that next poll, and we can get all of your 2 cents put in here. So just take a moment to answer the question, how would you categorize your organization's current fire preparedness plan? You just heard a little bit about basic, a little bit about comprehensive. So would you say it's one of those two? Would you say it's somewhere in between? Maybe you don't have a fire preparedness plan currently. Or maybe you're just not sure. Maybe it's not included in the charter of your roles and responsibilities currently. So just kind of let us know where you think you fall. And
it's a judgment-free zone.
Yes, exactly. All anonymous as well. So yeah, I think we can go ahead and close this one out, Bob, and share those results. Well, this isn't a surprise to me, though I am not the expert. You know, somewhere in between, right? People are trying to, figure this out, see what the best policies and procedures are. What do you think about that, Stan? Is that what you expected to see here in these results?
Well, I'm at least pleased that we're at a 50 percentile with somewhere between. I wouldn't have been surprised if more expressed a basic level, because a lot of times in the field, when I'm engaged to work with the client in any type of industry, it's usually because they've got a gap or a vulnerability. I'd like to think that, efforts by the National Fire Protection Association, local fire departments, trade organizations, organizations like those hosting today's webinar are being effective. So pleasantly surprised. What about you, Peter?
Yeah, same thing. I think one thing we always have to be careful of is this idea of confirmation bias. Like we think we're doing better than we are. So hopefully
Mhm.
Stan, and he enlightened me tremendously when we did the podcast interview a while back. There's things that I think I'm doing and I'm not really doing them.
Right.
So I hope I really pay attention today and see if maybe your answer might change on this a little bit at the end of the
Absolutely.
discussion here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, with that in mind, let's move on. So for those of you who responded that you do have a basic plan or no plan in place, you've definitely come to the right spot here today. And I'm going to turn it over to Stan now, who's going to go over how to create a comprehensive and sustainable plan. But for those of you who do already have a plan in place and consider it comprehensive, we have some tips, some best practices, and some reminders that can really help you level up. So Stan, why don't you take it away?
Well, everything starts with the basics. And even when I think about my 26-year career on the fire department to my last week in the fire station as deputy fire chief and fire marshal, I still had to focus on the basics. And, when it comes to fire and life safety in the home, in the workplace, phase one is always going to be prevention. It's kind of a strange concept to say a good day in the firehouse was when we went on 12 fires, a bunch of calls. I mean, our good days from a perspective of a first responder is most people's worst day. A really good day in the firehouse is when we never turn a wheel and never leave the station. And that's why prevention, is so important. Knowing the risks, integrating practices that will prevent ignition of a fire. Peter, that opening that you gave about statistics in a post-COVID world and so forth, really interesting. But I think one of the things that we're going to see evolving in fire prevention practices and potential ignition sources are more of a first world problem. And what I mean about that is the influx of batteries and electricity and those types of things in the workplace. One thing that comes to mind was that I have a client in San Francisco, a healthcare provider, senior housing provider, and you mentioned the ABHR. I mean, think about it, folks. You're putting flammable liquids in your corridors, in your halls, in your offices, in your residence rooms, in your patients' rooms to focus on infection control, yet as high as 95% alcohol, some of those liquids contain. Then there's another situation, cleanliness, keeping your buildings clean. Well, I had a situation where in a storage room, there was a cache of alcohol-based hand rub solution, hundreds of gallons. Right next to it, they were charging lithium batteries for their ionization cleaning equipment. Well, you
Wow.
know where this story's going. There was an overcharging of the battery. There was an explosion and there was a fire that had a fire sprinkler system not been in place, it could have been a catastrophic situation. So fire prevention, really focuses on what are the causes? What are the practices that we've integrated in our home, our office, our home office? A candle next to your desk might be really an inviting thing to utilize while you're working and trying to get into those Zen moments where you're overwhelmed with agendas and spreadsheets. But when you walk out of your office and you leave the window open, and I get it, I'm Fire Marshal Bill. I'm always thinking about the worst case scenario, but my career, my experience, and the work that I do with insurance companies and loss control entities reveal that I'm not going to cite specific statistics, but the overwhelming majority of fires that I responded to, that the firefighters in your community respond to, they all could have been prevented. So integrating fire prevention practices, embracing the fire inspector when she or he comes to your facility to conduct a proactive assessment of identifying the trip hazards, the fall hazards, the fire hazards, the things that can lead to an injury, a loss, a lawsuit, or any consequence, fire prevention really starts at the most basic level. And one of the things that maybe I overuse as a phrase, but it's not rocket science. This is the common sense things that most people avoid correcting because, and you touched upon this a little bit, Peter, they've got that optimistic bias ingrained in their DNA. Okay, a fire could happen because I left a candle unattended, but it probably won't happen to me until it does. So fire prevention is phase one, looking at the risks, identifying the unsafe practices, working with your risk management people, your safety people. Don't consider them an encumbrance to production, design, productivity. They are there. The safety geeks like us are there to make sure that the building is operational, sustainable, and that you've got continuity of operations after an adverse event, because the whole goal of fire prevention is to make sure all the bad things that potentially can happen don't happen.
What do organizations tend to overlook or perhaps maybe get wrong in the prevention phase?
Well, sometimes that overwhelming desire for function or productivity leads to that, I'm just going to turn and look the other way. Somebody has got to be a steward of safety and preparedness and fire prevention in the facility. So I think a lot of organizations don't identify a fire prevention champion or a disaster preparedness champion, someone that, it might not be the most unpopular, or it might not be the most popular position, but I remember when I was the fire marshal, I would do my annual bah humbug inspection. I'd have to go to the churches, the commercial occupancies, the office buildings, and say, yeah, no, you can't have a live Christmas tree in your front lobby right next to your main exit or entry point. And no, you need to take down the streamers from the fire sprinkler heads, because I get it. Putting that mistletoe right at the entrance of that office might be a really good strategic place, but you're compromising code enforcement or code compliance and the ability of these systems. So, having an overwhelming focus on your needs versus the safety elements is something to always consider.
So let's move on to phase two, Stan. What do you got next for us?
Well, response, Peter, you said a mouthful when you were talking about the deer in the headlight response.
Yeah.
One of the things that I focus on when I'm either teaching emergency response procedures at my clients' facilities, active shooter response, and the options that people that face what we call the unthinkable, we talk about why people fail to respond. Sometimes people just have an overwhelming need for things to be normal. And when your normal day is interrupted by smoke filtering in through your HVAC system or a fire alarm that sounds right when you're I don't want to jinx this, I'm knocking on wood, right when you're in the middle of a webinar, or when, a tornado siren or a weather alert comes across, or maybe a product like, what you promote at Alert Media, some type of mass comm system advises you to shelter in place. When it's a normal day until it isn't, sometimes that causes people just to fail to respond. Optimistic bias. Okay, it could happen, but it won't happen. When you are in the response phase, I tell people, especially if I'm at one of my healthcare providers, that everyone knows that their legal rights in this country and many countries around the world is essentially you are innocent until proven guilty. But when that fire alarm sounds, when somebody screams, shelter in place, take cover, active shooter, we have a fire in the building, your attitude as an employee should be guilty until proven innocent. Err on the side of safety and respond to every situation as if it's a real world scenario. Healthcare, and I think we'll get into some of the regulatory elements a little later in our talk, they're so highly regulated when it comes to fire drills, 1 per shift per quarter, disaster drills, tabletop exercises. Sometimes there's a level of drill fatigue that integrate into accredited organizations like might be on the call, maybe your industry, manufacturing, business. You're required to do so many drills that you don't know if it's real or if it's just another drill. My advice to you is always maintain situational awareness and always respond as if it's the real deal. If your protocol is that you stop your work, you secure your workstation, you report to the area of fire alarm system activation or where there is smoke or fire reported, and if it's your obligation or responsibility to grab a fire extinguisher on your way as you're going to that area, approach it as if it's the real deal every time. You know, statistically, the only time that firefighters do the job that they're engaged to do, according to the National Fire Protection Association, depending on if the department also provides EMS services, emergency medical services, is 3 to 9% of the time that they're on duty. And my career expressed that. You know, every time the alarm went off, every time we were dispatched to a call, it wasn't an actual fire. It was a very low percentage. But I conditioned my crew and my own workforce to think polar opposite from our sisters and brothers in blue, guilty until proven innocent. We're going to a fire until we know it's not a fire. And while it might be the 3rd time that we're responding to Carl Sandburg High School, my alma mater, on a fire alarm in the last quarter, I'm going to think that there's a fire there. I'm not in the mindset, oh, it's another false alarm. So my response tip, you know, is to take every situation real. Rely on your training, your drills, and your exercises. And innocent only after it's been confirmed that you don't have an actual emergency.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it, that any kind of practice or false alarm is just another way to get your muscle memory even better. So it's all for the good. And as you look back on your career, how often do employees not respond to a fire alarm at all because they just don't take it seriously? I think it's a mistake. Is it a pretty high percentage?
Yep, I can't give you the number, but better than 60%. I remember
Wow.
one particular fire I had. It was in a popular restaurant known for their customized burgers, and they did these onion rolls. So picture a coffee can stuffed with breaded onion rings that they put in a deep fat fryer, and you get this cylinder of onion rings versus the Awesome Blossom or something like that.
Uh,
So we get an alarm for an automatic fire alarm at this particular restaurant. I'm in my fire chief's car, leading the charge, pull up on the scene. I've got heavy black smoke coming out at the rear of the restaurant. I see that the cars are lined up in the driveway. It's clear that the building is probably pretty well occupied at 6 p.m. in the evening. Fire trucks are responding. Ladders are being thrown to the roof. Hoses are being dragged into the rear to the kitchen storage room that was on fire. As I do my 360 around the building, I do a walk around the building as the incident commander to identify, you know, that the building's been evacuated, look for any people that might need to be rescued, take command and control of the situation. I walk into the main dining room of the restaurant. Evacuation hasn't occurred. People are eating their onion rolls and their hamburgers as if nothing was going on. And when I took off my mask and helmet and said, folks, you need to evacuate the building is on fire. That's why the fire alarm is sounding. I didn't get a lot of happy looks and cooperation. I got more like, oh, geez,
wow.
people, you know, left their tables begrudgingly because they had to leave their meal because they just thought that they weren't in harm's way. You
Yeah.
know, it's that type of response. I remember a fire alarm activation in a bank. We pull up on the scene and tellers are still processing transactions while the alarm blares. And they had no idea that there was a rooftop HVAC unit that was on fire, that an in-duct smoke detector had alerted building occupants to the fire, yet because they didn't see or perceive an emergency, they didn't initiate a response. It's a
Hmm.
tragic statistic, But on 9/11 at the World Trade Center, occupants of the Twin Towers did not immediately leave their workspace. When there was reason to leave the workspace, they were told, even by officials in the building, everything's fine. Don't worry about it. We'll tell you when to leave. Err on the side of the potential worst case scenario, especially in the
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to the recovery step here. Stan, I'm interested to see what you have to say here.
Well, recovery, I think, is probably our biggest opportunity for improvement. Having capabilities to communicate to all stakeholders about next steps, having organizations and companies in your bullpen when you need cleanup, smoke removal. Not a scientific statistic, but I've said it before, I'll say it again. Forgive me for being redundant. It's not rocket science. Get your ducks in a row. Know who you're going to call. Know where you're going to have alternate workspace. Understand how you're going to communicate with your stakeholders, that being your employees, your customers, your vendors, your suppliers. Have a recovery plan, because recovery starts both in the planning and the response phase. And in the vulnerable sectors that I work in, particularly healthcare, they need to maintain continuity of services, continuity of care. Communications is such a critical part of recovery, and especially if it's an adverse event like a shooting or a fire where someone is injured or has been injured. There's going to be emotional trauma. Know who your crisis counselors are, who your legal entities are that you're going to touch base with so that you can protect exposures. Peter, that communication component of the recovery phase, I bet you're better to address than I am. But any critique that I've ever been involved with following an adverse event, things as big as the 1990 Plainfield tornado that was similar to the Joplin tornado, structure fires, transportation incidents, every time we critique those types of incidents, the number one opportunity for improvement is communications. Why don't you address that a little bit in the recovery phase?
Yeah, no, and I think we're definitely going to cover that in a little bit. I think I put a slide together on that. I did have a question based on something you just asked.
Yeah.
It's something I was thinking about, but a lot of people may not realize that workplace fires can impact not just them, but the whole community as well, especially if the business or organization that experienced the fire provides a really important service to that community. Is that something that you found true over the years as you were responding to fires and saw their impact in the recovery phase?
100%. And while it wasn't a fire, I think an example that we can all relate to was the devastating tornado earlier in the year outside of St. Louis, where an Amazon distribution center was severely impacted. I mean, come on, we expect that package to be here by 5 p.m. And I know that companies like Amazon and others have got contingency plan and disaster plans, but if you're a sole supplier, let's say in a more rural community, and you've had a fire that's taken out a critical resource, maybe you've supplied drinking water or food to the nursing homes and the hospitals. Yes, the residual impact or the indirect impact is pretty significant, or can be significant.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned something earlier, Stan, about regulatory requirements. So can you tell us a little more about that?
Yep, in my world, and I work in all industries, but I'm a specialist in healthcare. You've got funding agencies like CMS, the Veterans Administration, HUD. You've got accrediting agencies. You've got local codes. You've got county codes. You've got state codes, national codes. You've got regulations if you're a residential property. A lot of time, especially in healthcare, which one of the statistics that or one of the credos that we like to cite is that long-term care in the healthcare facilities that I work with is only second to the nuclear power industry when it comes to regulation. There's so many conflicting regulations that it's very frustrating for owners, operators, providers. So as you see on the screen, our pro tip is a general premise of code enforcement is that when you've got all those conflicts, all those intersections, whatever is the most stringent is typically going to apply. And I think when you're trying to be a good steward for safety and preparedness, especially fire safety in your facility, go with the highest level of fire safety, because that's going to provide the highest degrees of safety and protection.
What tends to cause, or just any kind of organization out there, the most confusion when it comes to understanding or perhaps complying with fire codes and regulations?
Well, it's a little bit abstract in my reply, but it's interpretation. I deal with a
Mm.
lot of state survey agencies and accrediting agencies and different local fire inspectors. And this is just the sad truth, but it's just human nature. Nobody interprets a code or regulation or even an interpretive guideline the same way. Everybody's got their own spin, their own biases, and it's not a perfect process. As a consultant, my company is engaged to try to be the objective person to navigate a regulation or a code. I had one of my clients say, you know why we engage you in fire and life safety? Because we want you to be our conscience. So there's conflict, but a consultant should also kind of be the conscience of an agency and give you an objective impression and try to help navigate those conflicts.
That's a good point. Well, Peter and I at Alert Media, we get asked about hazard vulnerability assessments all the time. So what are your thoughts here? I see you have 3 key components to outline. Stan.
That was to Peter? I thought you said Peter.
No, oh no, I just said we get asked about it all the time, so we're interested in hearing your thoughts on the hazard vulnerability assessment portion of it.
This is exactly what we kind of referred to earlier. You don't know what you don't know until you conduct a risk analysis or hazard vulnerability assessment. And for our friends on the line that are on the session today that are in healthcare, you know all about hazard vulnerability assessment. You want to identify the probability or the risks of an event from happening. You want to look at the impact to your business, to the people, to the property, and then you've got to factor in your levels of preparedness. What are your capacities, your capabilities? What plans do you have in there? HVAs need to be conducted collaboratively, so you put your committee together, you use different tools and resources that are out there to identify those threats, those perils, equate that to your capabilities both in the community and at the facility, and then you get a pretty good idea of how you're going to address these types of situations.
Do HVAs assess fire risk only, or do you recommend an all hazards approach to risk assessment?
100% an all hazards approach. Fire is only one risk, and that's the focus of today's discussion, but active shooter, tornado, severe weather, staffing shortages, supply interruption, communications, redundancy in communications, an all hazards approach is definitely what we promote and what I know Alert Media promotes and others that are in this discipline. We promote that you're ready for anything.
Excellent. Well, give us just some basics in terms of developing these preparedness plans, Stan. What are some general things to keep in mind?
Just like anything else, I think as a society, we've learned that narrative and voluminous written paragraphs and volumes on emergency procedures is not the ticket to success, that we want to develop specific and actionable policies and procedures that are predicated with bullet point type information, that we can ensure that we're developing an all-inclusive plan that creates a good timeline on how things need to be done, ABC, or 1, 2, 3. The key to a good plan is that it's not necessarily prescriptive, but it's flexible, that it provides a framework of command, control, decision-making, and leadership that you can consider, a roadmap. Consider it to be a roadmap for all types of emergencies. Some of the best practices, focus on the things that you can address in the planning stage, sources of power and energy. What are your alternate sources for those types of things? You want to make sure that you're keeping track of your staff, your residents, your patients, your vendors, and you want to create, protocols that are going to deal with the most common types of situations. Peter, when we had our discussion about wildfire, in some cases it's going to be advantageous to proactively and preemptively evacuate, or evacuate quickly if you've got a fast moving fire like the Camp Fire or some of the other fires that we've seen in California. Sometimes we might have to shelter in place. We need to have an all-inclusive comprehensive plan that even includes where are we going to meet, how are we going to account for our people, and again, how are we going to communicate all this to one another. One plan, one size does not fit all. The plan needs to be customized, yet it needs to be flexible and expandable, contractable. It needs to, meet the specific needs of the organization. And here's one other pro tip, not just the organization as a corporation or a company, but the specific individual locations and the factors in those specific areas where maybe your distribution center or restaurant or nursing home might be located.
Mhm.
Well,
And what about the good old training and testing
that's
part
what I
of
was
this, Dan?
wondering.
Yeah, always a big question we get here.
Well, like I said, 3 to 9% of the time being on duty for 26 years, that's the only window that we actually saw the action. The real rubber meets the road type experiences that we received was in the classroom. It was on the drill field. It was in the house that we had that we were able to tear apart, cut holes in the roof. We need to practice and taking advantage as much as we can to training, drills, and exercises is really the key to success. And there's other elements of training. It's not always just hands-on training, although there's a whole lot of benefit to that. There are certain things that we want to be careful with when we do training. Certainly, we're not going to be able to create fire conditions in a building or simulate an active shooter. Now you can, but you do that with a lot of risk to yourself as an organization. There's often headlines in the news where someone's been sued or someone has been held culpable in being overzealous in an active shooter drill or even a fire type drill. You've got to take into account the consequences of drills. That's why tabletop exercises are so important. And once you determine your strengths, your gaps, your opportunities for improvement, you want to take that information that you either gleaned from exercise training or drills or even real world incidents and integrate them into an improvement plan. Peter, I bet you're of the same mindset.
Yeah, and I have a question for you about micro trainings, something I
Yeah.
heard about from a podcast I did a while back, but it's like a quick reminders each day or week or something pretty frequent, but very small. And the guest that I had mentioned that every meeting at their organization begins with just a quick 1-minute briefing on where the exits are or any other important reminders related to safety in case of fire. What are your thoughts on that?
I love it. I mean, it's the same concept as those pre-flight instructions that you get
Ah,
when you board a plane. And the concept of continuous or frequent training that will help promote the building of culture and preparedness in an organization. Again, another ticket to success. I was just at a hospital up in Flagstaff where I did an hour with all the different shifts on armed intruder, active shooter awareness training. What are the options that they need to consider? And they invested an hour in that particular topic, but the administrator and the facility's maintenance director who's responsible for emergency preparedness at that facility said, every stand up, every staff meeting, we do pretty much the same thing. We talk about the fire alarm, we talk about a power failure, but I'm 100% into that concept. And thanks for bringing that up.
yeah.
Yeah, and just in terms of time, guys, I want to go ahead and skip to this communication slide next, as we've been promising our audience. So, Peter, do you want to go over a few best practices here?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that first, you should determine who needs to receive your fire-related communications and when. So I'll discuss those two together. Examples of stakeholders that you may want to notify about your fire preparedness plans and strategies. may just be the employees themselves, depending on your business. And those messages should be delivered through multiple channels and reiterated quite often, I would say. For your remote workers, consider sending them residential fire prevention tips so they can prepare their home offices. Super important not to overlook that. If someone in your organization used to run payroll at the office, but they're now doing it from their basement, that could have a massive impact, not just on their safety, but also on your business if they're not prepared. So something to really think about. But there are some cases where you may want other stakeholders, such as customers, vendors, partners, to know that you're investing in your fire strategy. In that case, perhaps you share that information in, let's say, like a newsletter, or maybe an email update, or post it on a website somewhere. Many large organizations, such as the National Park Service we referenced earlier, they do publish their fire preparedness plans on their websites to increase visibility and build public confidence in their overall preparedness efforts. If there's an actual structure fire on the premises, you want to notify any employees, neighbors, visitors, vendors who are in or perhaps nearby the building. And those communications could come in the form of audible alarms. That's the most obvious. Someone pulls the alarm on the wall, but then also things like emails, texts, PA announcements, desktop alerts, or even fire captains running around giving verbal commands in each area of the building. In fact, I interviewed someone on the podcast who that was his job on 9/11, and he was up on like the 90-something floor, and he walked in and told people like they were listening to the alarm go off, but they weren't leaving. And he's like, look, you got to get out of here, and finally convinced them to leave. So it's also important to communicate during each phase of the fire, which can include when it's first reported, when it's confirmed, and when it's been contained, and then finally when it's resolved. Now, let's talk about how to communicate. I highly suggest investing in a modern emergency communication solution out there that will allow you to do things like send messages over multiple channels. That's super important because you never know what is the right channel to reach someone on in a particular situation, or what will they really listen to, like the example I just gave you before. Something that provides two-way capabilities, so you can solicit really valuable feedback in real time to help you prioritize your response efforts. Are you out of the building? Yes or no? You know, are you stuck inside? Do you need assistance? It can be very helpful to get that two-way capability. Something that also allows for the creation of templates that can be launched quickly at time of need, because faster response can mean better outcomes. And that's the pro tip that we show in the bottom of the screen. Do your thinking in advance when things are calmer. And I also say that the solution really should offer a mobile app so you can send and manage your two-way communications from anywhere, not just your desk. Oftentimes you find yourself evacuating, running down a staircase or out in a field somewhere, and you've got to be able to access that, not just from a computer. And then lastly, very importantly, it's got to be easy to use. And I really can't stress this enough. If a solution's not easy to use, people will either not use it out of fear, not good, or they'll use it incorrectly, perhaps even worse. Either way, the outcome really isn't good. And all those features and many more are available in the Alert Media solution. So if you want to learn more about it, please reach out to us and let us know.
Yeah, actually, that was
go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that's a perfect segue, actually, because I did want to launch this last poll that's going to ask our folks just that.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, you guys have heard so much from Stan and Peter today, but actually, you know, Alert Media has a countless number actually of experts and specialists who can help you with all types of preparedness and response and communication plans. So do take a minute right now, just before we get into some audience questions, because I do want to make sure we have plenty of time for that. Just let us know if you're interested in learning more about how Alert Media can help. And if you tell us yes, we will follow up with you and get you all the information that you need. But you can also say no, not at this time. And of course, no hard feelings there. So just take another second, if you could, to let us know if you're interested. And then, Bob, you can just go ahead and close out this poll, because like I said, I do want to move on to some audience questions, and they are coming in fast and furious. So let's move on to that portion now. So I'm going to start with you, Stan. Is it true that the fire marshal requires a list of all employees that were in the building if there is a fire and we evacuate?
Well, require, I don't know, unless there is a local jurisdiction that has a code, ordinance, or some type of legal premise on requiring that. That was not the case within my jurisdiction, it's certainly a best practice. I mean, having a manifest of passengers on a plane or a ship, knowing who's in a building is certainly an asset, especially if there's a catastrophic incident like a boiler explosion or something like that. As far as it being a requirement, I don't know of local codes ordinances that typically requirement, but that's not to say that there isn't a jurisdiction that may have integrated that into their local requirements.
Gotcha. Okay. And we are just getting flooded with questions about remote workers. And this is a big one, right? When we said you need to have a plan that's inclusive of all your employees. So, Stan, do you recommend that the same tips that you're using at the office should be relayed to your remote workers at home about how they can prepare their homes, or rather prevent fires in their homes and be proactive?
Yeah, you know, the credo that we should always consider is if it looks unsafe, it probably is unsafe. And, you know, power needs have become so prevalent. I've seen extension cord into power strip, into extension cord, into a lamp cord that's taped with masking tape. I mean, yes, we've got to employ the same standards at home, because if you go back to the earlier parts of this program, and when Peter presented those statistics, and this is represented in my career, the large majority, or if not all, the fire deaths that I dealt with were in the home, in the place that we're most familiar with, and even to zero in even farther, in the place that you're most intimately familiar with, the bedroom. I mean, you're there sleeping, yet that's where the majority of fire deaths occur, in the home. And what's right off of, well, it's right off of my bedroom in my home office, the home office. It's right in that area. So yes, employ the same type of common sense, basic and even comprehensive fire safety principles at home as you would utilize at work.
And I'll go to you on that question too, Peter. Like, when and how should they communicate these fire prevention tips to remote workers? Like, should it be you know, I'm making this up, but like a tip a day, or, you know, what channels are best? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I think probably the most important thing to think about is you got to meet people where they are, and they all have different preferences. Less tech savvy workers probably appreciate an email or a link to a website, while more tech savvy people prefer things like messages in Slack or Teams. You got to think about these things because you want people to receive and digest this info, and they may ignore certain channels. So post that information in as many different forms and places to ensure the biggest uptake as possible. Now, as far as cadence, I would say it should be aligned with the risk profile of your people and should be directly proportionate to that risk. However, regardless of what the risk profile is, be sure to get it right, and it's hard, but you don't want to over communicate or you risk information fatigue, boy who called wolf syndrome, and they start to ignore you.
Wow, that's such a good, important thing to call out. Well, I have only a little bit more time here, but I think this is a good one. So Stan, let me ask you this. Someone says our building has a fire prevention plan that applies to all of the businesses and tenants in the building. Do we still need our own?
Good
Well, I
question.
think what you need to do is assess that plan, because in my experience, the plan for the building really is the basic plan. So it's going to address the common areas. The variable is, what type of business are you? Do you have 150 telecommunicators in a space in you know, rows that requires more of a comprehensive fire and evacuation plan? So I think it's kind of a good illustration of where we have a basic plan in the overall building, and each tenant needs to have a comprehensive plan and even a comprehensive communication plan. Because, you know, if I defer to Peter's example at the World Trade Center, where someone subsequent to that terror attack still had to make a persuasive argument to a workforce to leave, um, that argument should not be made in the midst of an emergency. It needs to be developed, and it needs to be communicated through training, through practice. And so I guess to answer the question directly, yes, the individual spaces still need their own comprehensive plan to identify the specific parameters that's happening inside their tenant space.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we are running out of time for questions, but I do have these amazing resources that I want to call out where you can find additional information. And then in just a moment, I'm going to have Stan and Peter's contact information as well. So first here on this slide, Stan recommends visiting the U.S. Fire Administration's website for helpful content. Things like digital presentations, sample social media posts, things that you can use to educate your employees. So we recommend you check that out. Of course, if you want to learn more about Stan's company, Fire and Life Safety Inc., or perhaps you want to employ his services, you can do so by calling the number you see here, or you can visit flsafety.org. And then finally, Alert Media has an informative guide on how to conduct a fire drill at work. So I recommend that you check that out at alertmedia.com in the resources section. And while you're there, we have a ton of free, yes, free resources there to help you prepare, respond, recover, and communicate through any emergency. So with that, I just want to pass along that Peter and Stan are both on LinkedIn. You can find them under their full names. You're welcome to connect with them, message them for any additional questions that you have, and they will get back to you as quickly as they can. And with that, Stan and Peter, I just want to thank you both for being here today. These are just incredible insights and facts, so we really appreciate your time. Stan, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Peter, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, that does conclude today's presentation. So thank you all for joining us today. I hope you'll join us for a future Alert Media webinar. We always love seeing familiar names and companies on our registration list. And I also want to thank Continuity Insights for being such a great partner and for hosting us today.